So this is the part that most people don't want to deal with. They don't want to think about it and they don't want to deal with it. But here we have a little saying, life happens, let's deal with it. Okay, so we're talking about the mutual terminations and evictions portion of lease management. Okay, and this is the part that most landlords fear. What happens if my resident needs to move out early, if they can no longer pay the rental obligation, if their finances abruptly change? What happens if they just stop paying rent? We don't know why, but they just stop paying rent and they need to be evicted. What happens in those situations and in that regard? Okay, so again, our saying, life happens, let's deal with it. Okay, so there is a clear process for eviction. We'll kind of deal with that one first. There's a clear process with eviction, and of course it's going through the court system if and when it gets to that point. Now, a lot of landlords are afraid to go through that process. However, when you have great management, you have great, again, what does it come back to? Documentation and communication. So when you have those two things and you've been up to par with those two things, then you no longer need to be afraid of the eviction process, because again, you have an income property to make your income. Okay, and one of the things that we do for you to kind of make this process easier is when you have to go forward and now speak with an attorney, and we'll recommend one for you if necessary if you don't have one of your own. But when you have to go forward and speak with them and say, okay, we need to go through the eviction process, instead of having your costs rack up, because that's what most people are concerned about, paying thousands and thousands of dollars for an eviction. Instead of having your costs rack up, we actually have the documentation and communication through this electronic portal. We get all of that together for you, and at this point, we've been talking to our attorneys long before you have to talk to yours, but we have all that information together for you, and we give it to them kind of in a package deal. Okay, so instead of being charged every single time they have to open an email, now they're looking at kind of the big picture of things, and you're able to reduce costs in that regard. So thousands of dollars is dwindled a lot when you're a little more prepared. Okay, the other aspect of that with the eviction part of the process is just how long it takes. Okay, so aside from cost, is how long it takes to actually get through the process. So again, we try to build the relationship with your resident from day one, and that's the reason why we're building this relationship. So if we get into some sort of legal situation such as eviction, they're not pushing back, avoiding, and doing all this crazy stuff like some of the horror stories that you hear of. Okay, at this point, it becomes just another means to solve a problem. Okay, and that's how we handle that, even starting from day one, making sure we keep those relationships going and we keep the lines of communication open. So hopefully we don't even have to get to this part, but if so, usually it's not as traumatic as landlords typically think it is. Okay, but an eviction is a part where you have to force your resident out of the property because they're no longer paying rent. Now, the part that I want to talk about is the mutual termination, because usually all the work that we've put into at this point, generally we don't have to get to eviction because we've stopped at what's called mutual termination. And with the mutual termination, it's a point where both you and the resident have decided to end the lease anytime, any date prior to the original lease end date. Okay, for, if they can't pay rent, they have an abrupt change in their financial situation, such as being fired from a job, X, Y, and Z, they've been relocated, whatever the case may be, a mutual termination is an option. Now, with that mutual termination, there are two different ways that you can kind of do that. So there's a definite lease end date. Okay, so that means through communication and understanding the situation, both you as the landlord and the resident have decided on a lease end date. Okay, so on this date, your lease is going to end regardless, and you're going to pay X amount of dollars in order to be released from your remaining obligations to the lease agreement. Okay, so that's one option. The second option is where it's a lease replacement. Okay, that means that the property goes back on the market, so the resident is still held liable for all obligations on the lease agreement, but they agree to have the property put back on the market. in order to find another qualified resident. So at that point, what that option does for you is it's placed on the market. We do showings like normal, that sort of thing. And once an approved applicant has gone through the application process and all the qualifications, and you decide, yes, I want to lease to this person, okay, at that point, that's when you decide a settlement amount to go ahead and end the lease agreement and the terms of the lease agreement for the current resident in the property. Okay, so I know that that may get a little confusing, a little jumbled, and that's something we can definitely talk about in more details. The main thing that you need to know from this portion of it is when it comes to mutual terminations and when it comes to evictions, you have options.